Okay, so get ready for this one because today we're diving deep into the Book of Enoch,
Ooh.
which I'm very excited about. And I
Yeah.
have to admit, when you sent over these Wikipedia excerpts in this PDF, I was like, what is this?
Right.
This looks wild.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty details, can you tell everybody just very briefly what is the Book of Enoch for people who've never even heard of it?
So the Book of Enoch, it's an ancient Jewish text, and it's pseudepigraphal, meaning it's attributed to someone, but probably wasn't written by that person.
Okay, so who is it attributed to?
It's attributed to Enoch, who is the great-grandfather of Noah. So we're talking way, way back.
Oh, okay.
And it's really interesting because even though it's not considered canonical by most Jewish and Christian groups,
Right.
there are parts of it that were found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, wow.
So it's definitely circulating amongst some ancient Jewish communities.
So clearly a book that people thought was important enough to preserve and copy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is it not considered canonical?
Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I think one of the main ones is that it presents a worldview and ideas about angels and demons that differ pretty significantly from what became mainstream rabbinic Judaism.
I see. So it's like a glimpse into an alternative version of Jewish thought.
Exactly. It gives us a window into a different understanding of the cosmos and humanity's place in it.
Now, speaking of alternative versions of things,
Yeah.
I have to bring up the story of the fallen angels and the giants because, oh my goodness, when I read this, I was like,
It's a great story.
I was hooked.
Yeah.
So for people who maybe haven't read the Book of Enoch, can you just set the stage? Like, what's going on with these angels and giants?
Okay, so imagine this. A group of angels, they get a little rebellious, and they decide to descend to Earth, specifically to Mount Hermon. And here's where it gets interesting. They start taking human wives.
Ooh, scandalous.
I know, right?
Yep.
And from these unions are born the Nephilim, who are these giant offspring.
And I just have to read this description because it's wild. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 300 ells. That's like 450 feet tall.
Yeah, they were not messing around with the size of these giants.
Like bigger than the Statue of Liberty.
Absolutely, larger than life, quite literally.
Okay, so what do we make of this story? I mean, on one level, it's this really entertaining story, but on another level, like, what was the point of including it in this book?
Well, I think it speaks to a lot of anxieties that were present in that time period. You have this idea of these boundaries between the divine and the human being crossed.
Right.
And then the consequences that come from that, this sort of like disruption of the natural order. And it's interesting because you see this theme of angelic rebellion pop up in other Jewish and Christian traditions as well.
It's the universal fear.
Right,
Right.
exactly. The fear of the unknown, the fear of what happens when these powerful beings step out of line.
Okay, so speaking of stepping out of line, the Book of Enoch doesn't shy away from naming names when it comes to these rebellious angels.
That's right. We get introduced to characters like Semjaza, who is the ringleader of this whole operation.
The mastermind.
Yeah, he's the one who convinces the other angels to come down to Earth. And then there's Azazel, who is this really fascinating figure.
Oh, yeah, he was my favorite.
Right. He's credited with teaching humans all sorts of forbidden knowledge, like how to work with metal, how to make cosmetics, and even the art of warfare.
I know. I thought that was so interesting that he's like the bringer of both good and bad knowledge.
It's very complex portrayal, right?
Hmm?
Because on the one hand, he's giving humanity these tools that could be used for good. But on the other hand, they're clearly being used for more nefarious purposes.
It's like that classic question, is knowledge itself good or bad, or is it how you use it?
Right. It's about the application of knowledge and the intentions behind it. And the Book of Enoch seems to suggest that maybe humanity wasn't quite ready for all this knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a theme that resonates even today, right? Like, we have all this technology and knowledge, but are we using it wisely?
It's a question worth pondering for sure.
Well, let's bring in a more familiar character into all of this,
Okay.
Noah. Because we know Noah from the Bible as the ark builder, you know, the flood survivor. But what role does he play in this whole pre-flood drama, according to the Book of Enoch?
So the Book of Enoch actually gives Noah a pretty significant role. He's not just this passive Fredger waiting for the flood to come. He's actually warned by an angel named Uriel about the impending destruction.
Okay, so he's got the inside scoop.
Yeah, he's given a heads up and then tasked by God with this incredibly important mission to preserve humanity and to rebuild a righteous world after the flood.
So he's like the chosen one.
Yeah, the vessel of hope for humanity.
That's fascinating because it adds a whole new dimension to the flood narrative that we're familiar with. It's not just about punishment, it's also about redemption and a fresh start.
Right, and it highlights Noah's role as this pivotal figure in God's plan for humanity.
I love how the Book of Enoch kind of weaves together these familiar biblical stories, but adds its own unique spin on them.
It definitely fills in some gaps and offers a different perspective.
And speaking of unique spins, we have to talk about the animal apocalypse.
Oh, yes. One of the most visually striking sections of the book.
Right, because it's not like a literal apocalypse of animals running wild, is it?
No, it's much more symbolic than that. Think of it as an allegorical representation of history, where different animals represent different people or groups.
Okay, so it's like a coded message, a way of understanding history through a different lens.
Exactly. And it's not just the animals themselves, but also the colors associated with them. White often represents purity, black represents sin, red often symbolizes blood and martyrdom.
It's like a whole visual language that we have to decode.
Right, and it requires a bit of interpretation to really understand what the author is trying to convey.
So give us an example, like what kind of animals are we talking about and who do they represent?
Okay, so for example, a white bull often represents Adam, the first human. A female heifer might represent Eve. And then you have a black bull, which might symbolize Cain, Adam and Eve's son, who committed the first murder.
It's fascinating how they use this imagery to tell the story of humanity's fall from grace and the consequences of sin.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the past. The animal apocalypse also seems to offer glimpses into the future, hinting at coming judgments and the ultimate triumph of good over evil.
It makes you think about how we still use symbols and metaphors today to try to understand complex events or express our hopes and fears about the future.
It's a very human impulse, isn't it? To try to make sense of the world through stories and symbols.
Absolutely.
And the animal apocalypse is a particularly vivid example of that.
Okay, so we've got these wild apocalyptic visions, but I'm also curious about the historical context. Like, when was this book written, and how does that influence how we understand it?
So, scholars believe that the Book of Enoch was written sometime between 300 and 100 BC, which was a really turbulent period in Jewish history.
Ooh, so there was a lot going on.
Yeah, there were foreign empires, internal conflicts, religious persecution, and a lot of uncertainty about the future.
And that makes sense because the Book of Enoch is full of this sense of urgency and a longing for a better world.
Exactly, and some scholars think that the animal apocalypse, with its depiction of struggle and judgment, might actually reflect specific historical events, like the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire.
Oh, wow. So it's like they were using this symbolic language to comment on the political and religious turmoil of their time.
Right, they were trying to make sense of their own chaotic world through this lens of prophecy and apocalyptic imagery.
It's amazing how this ancient text can speak to both the past and the future, blurring those lines between history and prophecy.
It definitely invites us to consider different layers of meaning and to think about how these ancient ideas might still be relevant to us today.
And speaking of different layers of meaning, we need to build into the Epistle of Enoch, which seems to take us even deeper into Enoch's cosmic journey.
Oh yeah, the epistle is where things get really interesting in terms of cosmology and Enoch's understanding of the structure of the universe.
Yeah, and it also introduces this idea of the 10 weeks, which, as you mentioned earlier, aren't literal weeks, but more like epochs of time.
Exactly. It's Enoch's way of mapping out the grand sweep of history, dividing it into these distinct periods, each with its own unique characteristics and challenges.
Okay, so 7 of these weeks represent the past, right?
Yeah.
And then the remaining 3 point towards the future.
That's the general structure, yeah.
Yeah.
And within those future weeks, there's a lot of talk about judgment, renewal, and the establishment of a new heaven.
So it's not just about looking back at the past, it's also about anticipating what's to come.
Right, and those future weeks are full of anticipation, both hopeful and fearful. It's like Enoch is peering into the future and seeing both the possibility of great darkness and the potential for ultimate redemption.
It's a really powerful way of thinking about time and history and how our choices today might shape the future.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, there's always hope for a better world.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there are some, shall we say, peculiar details tucked away in the Book of Enoch. I'm all ears. Spill the tea.
Okay, so remember the story of Noah's birth?
Yeah.
The one where he's born with skin white as snow and eyes that light up the whole house like the sun.
Yeah, it's hard to forget that image.
Well, it turns out there's more to the story. His father, Lamech, was so freaked out by Noah's unusual appearance that he actually ran away in fear.
Oh no, poor Lamech. But I mean, I guess I can't blame him for being a little spooked. A baby glowing like a miniature sun, that's not exactly normal.
Right, it's not your everyday newborn. Lamech was convinced that his wife had given birth to a child of the angels, which is why he was so terrified.
It's fascinating how they use these fantastical details to emphasize Noah's special destiny, his role as the chosen one who would ultimately save humanity.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, this is no ordinary baby. This is someone marked for greatness.
And it also speaks to the power of storytelling, right? How these ancient authors use these vivid details to capture the imagination and convey deeper truths about faith, destiny, and the nature of the divine.
You hit the nail on the head. The Book of Enoch is full of these incredible stories that both entertain and challenge us, inviting us to ponder the mysteries of the universe and our place within it.
It's a reminder that even texts that fall outside the mainstream can offer valuable insights and challenge our assumptions about the world. But for now, we need to take a short pause to gather our thoughts and prepare for the next leg of our journey through the Book of Enoch. Don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Book of Enoch. We are having so much fun exploring this text.
It really is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and there's so much packed into it. I mean, we've already talked about fallen angels, giants, a symbolic apocalypse featuring animals.
Right.
It's like, where do we even go from here?
Well, there's still plenty more to uncover. And one way to think about the Book of Enoch is that it's not just one single narrative. It's actually a compilation of different sections that were written over time.
Oh, so it's kind of like a collection of ancient wisdom, like different pieces that have been woven together.
Yeah, exactly. And scholars typically divide it into 5 main sections: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the astronomical book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch, which we touched on a bit earlier.
Okay, so that makes sense. And I'm guessing that animal apocalypse that we were talking about with all the crazy symbolism,
Right.
that falls under the dream visions category?
You got it. The animal apocalypse is actually one of 2 dream visions in that section. The other one is known as the Book of Dreams, and it also uses this really rich symbolic language to offer a glimpse into Enoch's understanding of God's plan for humanity.
It seems like symbolism is a recurring theme throughout the Book of Enoch. I mean, why do you think that is? Do you think there was a reason they chose to use so much symbolism?
It's a great question, and I think there are probably a couple of reasons at play here. One is that in many ancient cultures, symbolism served as a way to convey deeper truths that weren't always meant to be understood literally. It allowed the authors to explore really complex theological and philosophical concepts in a way that engaged the imagination.
I see. So it's not just about decoding the symbols, but also about thinking about the deeper meanings that they represent.
Right. And it's also worth considering that for the people who were writing and reading this text, symbolism was a very familiar way of communicating. They would have been accustomed to interpreting the world through symbols and metaphors.
It's like a whole different way of thinking.
Absolutely. And it challenges us to step outside of our modern mindset and try to see the world through their eyes.
Speaking of different ways of thinking, the astronomical book really caught my attention because it seems like Enoch was fascinated by the cosmos.
Oh yeah, the astronomical book is a fascinating read. It dives deep into the movements of celestial bodies, the intricacies of the calendar, and the cycles of the seasons. And it shows a remarkable level of astronomical knowledge for the time period.
It makes you wonder how much of this knowledge was based on actual observation and how much was influenced by their religious beliefs or mythology. Did they even make a distinction between science and religion back then?
That's a really interesting question, and I think the answer is probably not in the way that we do today. In ancient cultures, the lines between science and religion were often blurred. The cosmos was seen as a reflection of the divine order, so astronomical observations were often intertwined with religious beliefs and rituals.
So the stars weren't just points of light in the sky, they were seen as signs, portents, maybe even representations of divine power.
Exactly, and I think that perspective really comes through in the astronomical book. It's not just a dry treatise on astronomy. It's also an attempt to understand the relationship between the heavens and the earth and the divine forces that govern the universe.
So we've got these fallen angels, these giants, all this talk about astronomy and apocalypse. I mean, it's a lot to take in. But one question that keeps coming back to me is, if the Book of Enoch isn't considered canonical, how did it even survive all these centuries? Why didn't it just disappear?
It's a testament to the text's enduring power and the fascination it held for various groups throughout history. While it wasn't accepted into the mainstream Jewish or Christian canons, it was preserved and cherished by certain communities who saw value in its teachings and insights.
So it's like it had its own underground following and a dedicated group of readers who kept it alive.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the key reasons for its survival was its inclusion in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible.
Wow, so it actually became part of a canonical text in a different tradition.
Mhm.
That's incredible. It's like the Book of Enoch found a home where its unique perspective was not only accepted, but embraced as authoritative.
Absolutely. And it highlights the fact that religious traditions are diverse and complex, and that what might be considered outside in one tradition can be central in another.
And speaking of things that are a little bit outside or unusual, you mentioned that the Book of Enoch contains some rather peculiar details. I'm curious, what did you uncover?
Okay, so remember we were talking about the story of Noah's birth?
Yeah, the one where he's basically a glowing baby.
Well, it gets even stranger than that. Remember how his father Lamech was freaked out by his appearance? Well, it turns out that Lamech was so terrified that he actually fled in fear, thinking that his wife had given birth to a child of the angels.
Oh, wow. That's an intense reaction.
Right, it really emphasizes how extraordinary Noah's birth was supposed to be.
So it's not your typical birth announcement.
Definitely not. And it speaks to that sense of awe and wonder that the Book of Enoch evokes. It's full of these incredible stories that blend the familiar with the strange and fantastical.
It's like a glimpse into a world where anything is possible.
Exactly, and it challenges us to expand our imaginations and consider different ways of understanding the world.
Okay, but let's talk about some more of these fantastic elements because earlier you mentioned something about a leviathan. Now that's a name that sends shivers down my spine. I mean, we're talking about a colossal sea monster, right?
The Leviathan is a legendary creature that pops up in various mythologies and religious texts. It's often depicted as this massive sea serpent or a dragon-like creature embodying chaos and the untamed forces of nature.
Okay, so how does the Book of Enoch portray this fearsome beast?
It describes the Leviathan as a female monster dwelling in the depths of the sea, and she's so massive that she could devour an entire island in a single gulp.
Oh my goodness, that's a creature I would not want to encounter on a casual swim.
No kidding. It really speaks to the ancient fear of the unknown and the untamed power of the natural world.
It's interesting how they use these mythical creatures to explore those themes of order versus chaos and the fragility of human existence in the face of these overwhelming forces.
Right, and it's not just about fear. It's also about recognizing the power and majesty of creation.
Okay, so we've got this terrifying Leviathan lurking in the depths. But you also mention another creature, the behemoth. What's the deal with that one?
The behemoth is another colossal creature, but this one is a land-dwelling beast. It's often depicted as a bull-like creature with immense strength and an unquenchable appetite.
So we've got a sea monster and a land monster. It's like the Book of Enoch is creating its own monster manual.
It definitely has a flair for the dramatic.
Yeah.
And it uses these creatures to really drive home the point that there are forces in the universe that are far beyond human comprehension and control.
It's a humbling thought, isn't it?
It is, and it reminds us that we're just a small part of a much larger and more mysterious cosmos.
But with all these fantastical elements and all this talk about apocalypse and judgment, what do you think is the overall message of the Book of Enoch?
Well, as we've seen, it's a very complex text with multiple layers of meaning. But I think if we were to distill it down to its essence, it's a call to righteousness, a warning against the consequences of sin, and a reminder that our choices have eternal significance.
So it's not just a collection of wild stories. It's actually a guide for living a virtuous life.
Exactly. And it offers a vision of a world where justice prevails, where the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. It's a message that has resonated with people for centuries.
It's interesting how this ancient text can still speak to us today. I mean, we might not believe in angels and demons in the same way that they did, but the core message of choosing good over evil and living a life of purpose, that's something that's still very relevant.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Book of Enoch continues to fascinate and intrigue us. It speaks to those universal human desires for justice, meaning, and a hope for a better world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive, but there's still one more section we need to revisit, the Epistle of Enoch, with its intriguing vision of a new heaven and all those cosmic secrets.
Oh, yes. The epistle is where things get really interesting in terms of Enoch's understanding of the afterlife and the ultimate destiny of humanity.
And trust me, folks, you don't want to miss this. So stay tuned. We'll be right back to uncover even more secrets from the Book of Enoch. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Book of Enoch, and I'm really excited to kind of wrap things up by revisiting that Epistle of Enoch.
Yeah, the epistle is really fascinating. It offers a lot of intriguing insights into Enoch's worldview.
Yeah, it's kind of like the grand finale, right? It ties everything together and gives us a glimpse into what Enoch believed about the ultimate destiny of humanity.
Exactly. And it also introduces this really compelling idea of a new heaven, which we've touched on briefly but haven't really explored in depth.
Right, and that's what I really want to dig into because it seems to suggest a total transformation, like a wiping clean of the slate, a new beginning.
The Epistle of Enoch definitely describes a time of ultimate renewal, a kind of cosmic reset where the old order is swept away and a new one is established.
So it's not just about judgment and punishment like a lot of apocalyptic literature focuses on.
No, it's much more than that. While the Book of Enoch does emphasize the consequences of sin and the need for repentance, it ultimately offers a vision of hope for those who choose righteousness.
It's like a reminder that even in the face of darkness and chaos, there's always the possibility of redemption and a brighter future.
Exactly, and I think that message of hope is particularly powerful given the turbulent times in which the Book of Enoch was written.
Yeah, it makes sense that people who were facing persecution and uncertainty would find comfort in the idea of a new heaven and a new earth where justice and peace would prevail.
Absolutely, and that message continues to resonate with people today, especially in times of crisis and upheaval.
Okay, so we've talked about the new heaven, but I'm also curious about the Epistle of Enoch itself. Like, what kind of content does it contain? What are some of the key themes that stand out?
Well, the Epistle of Enoch is really a collection of different writings and teachings that are attributed to Enoch. And it covers a wide range of topics, including cosmology, ethics, eschatology, and even some practical advice on how to live a righteous life.
So it's like a guidebook for living in accordance with God's will.
In a way, yes.
Ah,
But it's also a lot more than that. It's a window into Enoch's profound understanding of the universe and humanity's place within it.
and it also introduces this idea of the 10 weeks, which we've talked about before, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's such a unique way of framing history.
Right, so these 10 weeks aren't literal weeks, but rather symbolic epochs or periods of time that represent the unfolding of God's plan for humanity.
Okay, so 7 of these weeks represent the past, leading up to Enoch's own time, and then the remaining 3 point towards the future.
Exactly. And those future weeks are full of anticipation. They describe a time of judgment, renewal, and ultimately the establishment of a new heaven and a new earth.
It's like a cosmic roadmap, a way of understanding where we've come from and where we're headed.
And it also highlights the idea that history is not just a random series of events, but rather part of a larger divine plan.
Now, you mentioned that the Epistle of Enoch contains some practical advice on how to live a righteous life. Can you give us some examples of what kind of advice Enoch offers?
Well, Enoch emphasizes the importance of things like humility, compassion, justice, and faithfulness to God. He also warns against the dangers of pride, greed, and wickedness.
So it's kind of like a blend of ethical teachings and spiritual guidance.
Yeah, and it's presented in a very poetic and evocative way. Enoch uses a lot of imagery and metaphors to convey his message.
So it's not just a dry list of rules, but rather a call to live a life that's aligned with higher spiritual principles.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes the Epistle of Enoch so compelling. It's not just about following the letter of the law, but rather about cultivating a heart that's in tune with God's will.
But here's a question that keeps coming back to me. If the Book of Enoch isn't considered canonical, why should we even care about it? What makes it relevant to us today?
That's a fair question. And I think there are a couple of reasons why the Book of Enoch is still worth studying and reflecting on. First of all, it provides a valuable window into the beliefs and ideas that were circulating in Jewish and Christian communities during the Second Temple period. It helps us understand the context in which these traditions developed and how they were shaped by the historical and cultural forces of the time.
So it's kind of like a time capsule, a glimpse into a different world that can help us better understand our own.
Exactly. And secondly, the Book of Enoch, despite its non-canonical status, has had a profound influence on literature, art, and even popular culture. Themes of fallen angels, giants, and apocalyptic prophecy, all of which feature prominently in the Book of Enoch, have inspired countless works of imagination over the centuries.
So it's like its ideas have seeped into our collective unconscious, shaping how we think about good and evil, heaven and hell, and the ultimate destiny of humanity.
Right. And that's why I think it's so important to engage with these ancient texts. Even if we don't necessarily agree with everything they say, they offer a different perspective, a challenge to our assumptions, and a reminder that the human imagination has always been drawn to these big questions about the meaning of life, the nature of the universe, and our place within it.
It's like a reminder that we're part of a much larger conversation that's been going on for centuries.
Absolutely. And the Book of Enoch is a particularly rich and fascinating voice in that conversation.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the Book of Enoch, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will remember?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that the Book of Enoch is not a monolithic text. It's a collection of different writings that were composed over time and reflect a variety of perspectives and interpretations. So it's important to approach it with a critical and discerning mind and to recognize that there's no single right way to understand it.
That's a really important point because it's easy to get caught up in the fantastical elements of the Book of Enoch and forget that it was written by real people who were grappling with real questions about their faith and their world.
And I think another key takeaway is that the Book of Enoch, despite its non-canonical status, offers some really profound insights into human nature and the human condition. It explores themes of good and evil, justice and mercy, the nature of knowledge, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. And these are themes that are still relevant to us today, even if we live in a very different world than the one in which the Book of Enoch was written.
It's a reminder that even ancient texts can still speak to us in powerful ways, and that the human experience, despite all its complexities and challenges, is something that connects us across time and cultures.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about studying ancient literature. It allows us to step outside of our own time and place and connect with the hopes, fears, and dreams of people who lived long ago. And in doing so, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our own place in the world.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the Book of Enoch. It's been a wild ride full of twists and turns, and I want to thank you for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating text with you, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as much as we have.
Remember, there's always more to discover, more layers to uncover. So keep those curious minds engaged, and until next time, happy diving.